Skyscrapers, please forgive me.
The Chicago Architecture Biennial is in full swing these days, but as the city celebrates all things architectural, a major work designed by a top protege of modernist architect Mies van der Rohe is now being readied for the Wreckers Ball. I'm Lee Bay, and welcome again to Architecture 360. The Public Building Commission, an agency that oversees the construction of Chicago's schools, police stations, firehouses, and the like, has put out a $10 million bid to demolish Malcolm X College. The powerful, low-slung steel and glass building was designed by Gene Summers, an architect who worked closely with Mies in designing buildings like Berlin's National Gallery and the stellar Seagram's building in New York City. Malcolm X was completed in 1971. A new medical-themed city college is under construction on a portion of the college site. The building itself will be raised to make room for a facility for the Chicago Blackhawks. Word of the planned demolition came down just as the inaugural Architectural Biennial, a toast to architecture and the role Chicago plays in it, kicked off this month. Joining us to talk about Malcolm X and its importance is noted architectural preservationist, writer, and thought leader Vince Michael.
Thank you very much, Lee. It's great to be back in Chicago in October, and although it's a little surreal because the Cubs are in the playoffs.
Well, it's good to have you back here to talk about architecture. I want to jump right on in to a thing that's in the news, or soon will be in the news. The plans to demolish Malcolm X College. Talk about this building a little bit, modernist building,
Sure.
And why this sort of fate, if you will, is not a good thing.
Well, it's a wonderful building. It's one I noticed my whole life, at least since it was built. It's considered Gene Summers' second great building. If you look up anything about Gene Summers, he was an architect born in San Antonio, helped Mies van der Rohe out for about 15 years. And then when McCormick Place burned down, they tapped C.F. Murphy. They asked Mies, and then they tapped C.F. Murphy, and they brought in Gene Summers, who became the principal designer, along with a very young Helmut Jahn. And McCormick Place was rebuilt in 71 at the same time he did Malcolm X College. And if you look at the obituaries of Gene Summers from 4 years ago, it's the second building listed. It's his second great building after McCormick Place is Malcolm X College. And if you look at it, it's a wonderful Miesian composition. I mean, we often say, I think it was Vincent Scully said that the Daly Center was the only great Miesian building not by Mies. But you could argue that this wonderful low-rise is a great example. It's perfectly regular. It's just two sections, has these lovely little third-floor courtyards, beautiful heavy steel beams on the outside, very much like IIT,
right?
Except he uses a bigger module. Instead of a 24 by 12 module, he's using a 24 by 24 module. They've already put out a request for proposals to demolish it. And it's sort of sad. It's interesting, actually, if you dig through the 372 pages of the request for proposals, one of the things in there is you find a 1985 document about how they needed to do asbestos abatement. And it was going to be done by 87. They were going to close the school for a year. So they obviously, for 30 years, didn't deal with that.
Yeah, it's a tough call. I mean, and this building, I spoke about this to another architect in town, and he said this building deserves a place on the National Register, not the demolition list.
I agree 100%. And you think of that near West Side area, which has been so dramatically transformed the last 50 years.
Sure.
This is one that always stood out as really solid architecture. It really does well. He treats the corners, the inset corners, the same way Mies did at IIT. It really is, someone. He went back and then became the dean of the College of Architecture at IIT. So he really followed in the footsteps of Mies, both architecturally and professionally.
Now, one thing that this sort of shines some light on is that buildings of this vintage are in danger of demolition, not only here in this site, but many places around the country, around the world.
Well, one of the things is they are seen as too new to care about. And one of the problems with the National Register, and at the risk of self-promotion, I've been going around and speaking to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation and others about changes we have to make to the National Register, which is 50 years old next year. One of the big problems is they have this 50-year rule, that a building needs to be 50 years old to be considered, or you have to prove special significance, like it was done by Mies or someone really prominent. If you look at the history of where the 50-year rule came from, it came out of thin air. They had no justification for it when they did it. They just thought, well, 50, that seems good. And it actually makes no sense, because if you think about building lives, buildings get rehabbed and need their systems adjusted after about 25, 30 years, which would make a lot more sense, because that's when they're first going to be threatened.
So there's a significant amount of buildings that are architecturally important that aren't 50 yet, that possibly could be endangered in some place.
Absolutely, and they often are. Chicago, actually, to its credit, the Chicago Landmarks Commission and the Chicago Landmarks Ordinance doesn't have a 50-year rule.
That's right.
And they have landmark things like 860, 880 Lakeshore Drive, and the nuclear energy site. I mean, you can come up with a pretty good list of buildings in Chicago. And I think that makes more sense. New York, I think, has a 35-year rule or something like that. Mm-hmm. But no, this is a whole category, and I've been involved with efforts to preserve modernism for a number of years. I had the opportunity to speak at Modernism Week in Palm Springs.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, this February, and this was their 10th anniversary. I spoke there 4 years ago, and in both cases about preserving modernism in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting story because in a lot of ways, Chicago was always preserving modernism. If you look at the first landmarks ordinance, that was passed with the zoning code in 1957, they included inland steel. Paint wasn't dry yet.
That's right. That's right. Mm-hmm.
And so Chicagoans, because of their particular architectural history and significance, have always felt, okay, there's sort of a continuity up to the present, which is nice. But modernism is huge now. Modernism Week in Palm Springs attracted 59,000 people this year.
Wow.
The interest in this stuff is off the charts, and it's.
Is it people who are like our age now who are saying, "Hey, these are landmark buildings," or is it madmen, which I hear a lot? I mean, what's driving this a bit?
I think it's both of those things, Lee. I think it's a little the madmen and the sort of nostalgia for that era has finally become appropriate or interesting.
Sure.
It's also a little bit the fact that these buildings have come to some of them are 50 years old, some of them are 60 years old. So they're getting to a point where people tend to appreciate, you disregard the immediate predecessor, but you really like the one before.
Sure.
So people might not be interested in the 70s or 80s, but they're really into the 50s and 60s. It was the era of fast cars and high fashion. And plus, you can also get that stuff. So if someone wants to trick out their modernist Richard Neutra house or something like that, they can still find old atomic clocks and Fiesta ware and whatever you need.
So it's kind of interesting. There's this kind of dichotomy, this kind of push and pull where these buildings are, on one hand, quite endangered, and then on the other hand, the interest in them is rising, is becoming high.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things, I mean, I guess we're experts, but, if you look at what people like in popular what becomes popular in architecture, they often lead the experts. They certainly lead the architectural historians. Mm-hmm. I always point to back in 1961, Greenwich Village rised up to save the Jefferson Market Courthouse, which was high Victorian. Architectural historians hated Victorian at the time. Mm-hmm. But eventually, by the 70s, Victorian is hot. So I think we're seeing the same thing with mid-century modernism.
So what's the takeaway here? What do we do?
What we really need to do is have a great survey of mid-century modernism. Now, I know Jim Peters and students at the School of the Art Institute have done a nice one for the sort of collar community.
Exactly, the suburbs, yeah.
But we really need to do it for the city of Chicago.
Well, Vince Michael, thanks for joining us, and welcome back to Chicago.
Thank you, Lee. It's wonderful to be here.